So as we continue following the schedule of our Sunday school curriculum, the Gospel Project, today we get to look at maybe one of the most loved Bible stories in the Bible. That'd be the story of David and Goliath. And definitely it's an exciting story. It's a story that kind of captures our imagination. All kinds of songs have been written about it. You can see lots of pictures that have been drawn of this event. And maybe those pictures sometimes make us just kind of think it's a cute story, because you'll see the picture and there's scrawny little David, and then there's the giant Goliath who's about 3 times as tall as he is. And if you read the description in the Bible, that's not quite what it was. Goliath was probably right around 9 feet tall, so definitely a big dude, but not quite 30 feet tall. So just that reminder, because again, this isn't just a story. This is a true event that happened. It's a true description of how God acted in history at this point. And so as we study this account, there's a lot we can learn from David and from his faith, but we also can't stop there, because there's a lot that we can learn about God. And so as we go through 1 Samuel chapters 16 and 17 today, we're going to be looking at 4 things. First of all, David's heart. Secondly, David's faith. Thirdly, David's battle. And then finally, God's victory. So first, David's heart. So what happened, if you'll remember, God had rejected Saul from being king. Saul had disobeyed God, and God said, I reject you as king. And so God commanded Samuel to go anoint another king, to anoint the future king. And he tells him to go to Bethlehem. And there was a man there by the name of Jesse who had, I'm forgetting whether it was 6 or 7 sons, several sons. And it was going to be one of his sons that was going to be the future king. And so what happens is Jesse shows Samuel his sons in order from oldest to youngest. And so Samuel sees the first son and looks at him, and he's tall, he's strong, he's handsome. He thinks, definitely this has to be the king. But that wasn't how God saw it. So if you look at chapter 16, verse 7, we see God explaining this to Samuel. 1 Samuel 16, 7. I'll actually start with verse 6. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And so there you see how God wasn't so concerned about what this person looked like. He was concerned about the heart of the future king. And so they go on down the line of all of Jesse's sons. And it turns out David's not even there. He is off tending the sheep. And are these all of your sons? And Jesse says, well, there is David. So then Samuel says, go get him. We won't sit until he gets here. And maybe this is just how my mind works, but I think, man, how long? They didn't have like a telephone to call up David at that point. They had to send a messenger to get David and bring him back. And I'm like, they were standing that whole time? Sorry, not an important detail, but that's how my mind works. Anyway, they finally bring David in. And then God says, yes, this is the guy who's going to be the future king. And so Samuel anoints David as the king. So we're told there that God looks at the heart. And we could ask, well, what was special about David's heart? And we're given a bit of an answer here as we continue to look through this account. We see David's faith in God. That obviously, for those of us who know the story, obviously David had strong faith to face the giant Goliath. But as we think about faith, sometimes we can kind of get the wrong idea about faith. We'll look at David as a story about someone with great faith, and that we should have great faith like them. But soon the focus becomes how strong our faith is, instead of focusing on the one that we're supposed to put our faith in. And you actually see this even in Christian circles a lot, unfortunately. You'll hear maybe sermons on David. I've seen little clips of them. And the preacher saying, we're going to cast our stones and we're going to slay our giants. And it's kind of this idea that if you have strong enough faith, you can do anything. You can defeat any problem in your life. And soon again, the focus is on how strong your faith is, and the focus is on defeating the bad things in your life, instead of the focus being on God's power and on Him being glorified through you. Sometimes phrases like name it and claim it. So I'm naming this, I'm declaring this as I believe in God, and therefore it's going to happen. Or you possess what you confess. I confess I believe God is going to give this to me, and so therefore it's going to happen. But then what if it doesn't happen? And actually I've even seen the phrase, go to this place and learn to be healed. So you need to go learn how to have the right kind of faith so that God will heal you. And so soon you're always looking at yourself, is my faith big enough? Is my faith strong enough? And soon you're depending on yourself to have stronger faith instead of depending on God and on His power. And David shows us this because David doesn't brag about how strong his faith is. No, instead David is always pointing back to God and how powerful God is. And we'll see this as we continue here. So the Israelites soon were going to war. After David is anointed as king, soon the Israelites go to war against the Philistines. And so they've got their battle lines, and 3 of David's brothers go into battle. And so his father, Jesse, says, hey, go check up on your brothers and bring them this food. So David now goes and he visits the battle line. And at that point, he's exposed to Goliath. You see, Goliath was this 9-foot-tall champion for the Philistines. And he had challenged the Israelites. He was basically saying, we don't have to do this big battle thing. What if I just go up against your best warrior, and then that decides it? One-on-one, we'll end this battle, we'll end this war right here. And so he's been taunting them for days, saying, hey, find your hero, find your champion, have him face me. And so while David's at the battle line, David hears this. And he's offended by it because he realizes what is happening is that God is being mocked. You see, Goliath isn't just trash-talking the army. Goliath is trash-talking the God that the Israelite army serves. And David sees this and he says, how dare he challenge our God? Our God can defeat that giant. And so we see David's response in chapter 17, verse 26. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Basically, who does this guy think he is to challenge the armies who serve the one true God? And so then David volunteers to take on the giant Goliath. And so King Saul hears about this, and he has David come to him, and then we see Saul's response in verse 33, 1 Samuel 17:33. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. So Saul naturally has his doubts. Here's this young guy coming up to him saying, I'm going to take on this 9-foot warrior. But then look at David's response. And look how his focus isn't on how strong he is. It's on how God has power and God has used him to do great things already. So, verse 34 then. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So again, we see David's focus. His focus is that God had delivered him from the lion. God had allowed him to defeat a bear. And now God was going to help him defeat this Philistine, defeat Goliath. David's faith was not on how powerful. David's faith was not in how strong his faith was. David's faith was in the power of God. He was dependent on God. So Saul tells David to go into battle, but he says, wait, you're going to need some armor. Take mine, wear my armor into battle. And so David tries it on, and then basically says, you know what, I can't fight like this. I'm going to fight how I'm used to fighting, which is with a sling and stones. And I mention that because just briefly, I want to make a point there. I think sometimes we can look at other people and think, man, they've got there's great things about them that God can use. I'm not a good speaker like that person. I don't know the Bible like that person. I don't have a lot of money like that person. And so we think God can use those people, but he can't use me. Or we wait and we think, I've got to get just the perfect plan before I serve God in some way. But you see here, David was just himself. He said, I can't be one of those warriors with that armor. I'm just going to go fight how I know how. And I think that should be an encouragement for us when we're saying, how should I serve God? What can I do for God? It can be an encouragement that we don't have to wait around for the perfect plan. We don't have to wait until we become someone we're not. But we can serve God with the gifts and personality he's given us now. A while ago, someone wrote a book called Just Do Something. And that was kind of the point. That sometimes we wait around for the perfect moment to serve God in some way. And sometimes it's okay to just say, I believe God's powerful, I believe God will use me, and so I'm just going to do something to serve him. I see a need, therefore I'm going to try to do something with that need. And from David, we also see one other truth about faith. And that's that faith is not passive. You could think that I have a strong faith in God. I know it's him and his power who does it anyway. So I'm just going to sit back on my couch and watch God do great things. But that's not what David does. He doesn't say, I'm going to sit back and see how God defeats this giant. No, instead he says, I know God will defeat this giant. Therefore, I'm going to get involved. Therefore, I'm going to be active. Therefore, I'm going to serve God because God is great. And so David's faith led him into battle with Goliath. So we've talked about David's heart, we've talked about David's faith, and now let's look at David's battle. Really, this young boy going to battle against a 9-foot giant seems like a pretty bad idea. And it seems like an even worse idea when all he has is a slingshot that he's going to use to throw a stone at this big giant. And yet David goes into battle confident in God's power. And we see this confidence in chapter 17, verse 46. This is David talking to Goliath. And you could say he's kind of trash talking at this point too. But he's trash talking because he knows God's going to win. 17:46. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. I want to look at David's focus there again at the end of verse 46. Notice what he says. What's the reason? Why is he going into battle? Is he going into battle because Goliath had become inconvenient for him? Is he going into battle because Goliath has become a pain in the neck for him and his friends? Again, sometimes that's how defeating our giants is talked about. Just getting rid of those troubles in our lives. But notice why David isn't going into battle here. He says that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. David is going into battle for God's glory, so that God wouldn't be mocked anymore. He's going into battle so that everyone will see how powerful his God is. That's his focus. And then we see the result. After David goes confidently into battle, what happens? Verse 49. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. So David defeats Goliath because of God's power. And that's emphasized in verse 50. It says, there was no sword in his hand. This plan shouldn't have worked. Throwing a stone at this giant shouldn't have worked. But because of God's power, it did. And so David boldly trusted God and went into battle against this giant. But it really wasn't his victory. No, it was God's victory. You see, David, he's definitely a good example to learn from. We can learn from his faith. We can learn from his boldness. We can learn from how he went into battle and took action to serve God. But this account is really about God's power and God's victory. And we can talk a lot about how we should be more like David. But in reality, a lot of the time, we're probably a lot more like the rest of the army, aren't we? We're the ones looking at problems in our world, not trusting that God can really take care of them. We're cowering in fear. We're scared to take action. We're not trusting God's power. And each person here is facing a giant that you can't defeat. In your natural condition, there's a giant that no one can defeat. And that's the giant of sin, the giant of death, the giant of Satan. We face this giant, and we're powerless to defeat the giant. And so we need a hero to step in and defeat this giant for us. And so in this way, David becomes a picture of Jesus. Because Jesus is the one who stepped into our world to do battle with sin, death, and the devil for us. And as Jesus died on the cross, he took our sin on himself and he paid the price for it. But then he didn't stay dead. He rose again from the dead. And so he defeated both sin and death, and also the devil for us. Jesus defeated the giant for us. Now, after David defeated Goliath, suddenly the rest of the army got really confident and bold. And so they chased after the Philistines as they ran away, and they defeated that Philistine army. And we read about it in verse 47. Verse 52. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. So after they saw David defeat this giant, suddenly they were confident to take action. Because basically the battle had already been won. David had won the biggest victory for them already. And the same is true with us in Jesus. Why is it that we can be confident to take action as we serve God? Why can we be confident as we face those smaller giants in our lives? Because Jesus has already defeated the greatest giant for us. He already has ultimately won the victory. And so we get to then go do battle knowing the victory is already won. But again, we don't live that way, do we? We fearfully focus on the different giants in our lives. Or we think, I'll let someone else fight that battle. So let's just think about some of the giants that we see in our community. Some of the giants that we don't really trust God can help. In our community, we see poverty. In our community, we see drug addiction and alcoholism. In our community, we see hurting families. We see hurting children, broken children from those broken families. In our community, we see idolatry, where people are chasing after other things, worshiping all this other stuff instead of worshiping God. That can be the activities of school, that can be money, that can be possessions, whatever it is. That can be careers. But people are focusing on those things and worshiping those things instead of God. We see apathy. A lot of people in our community who would claim a faith in God, but really don't seem to care about living for them with their lives. So really in our community, you could summarize it by the fact that we see a whole lot of people who need Jesus. And I think often that seems like a big giant that we can't really do anything about. We don't trust that we can really make a difference in those situations. I read a book a little while ago called Small Town Jesus, and basically it was written by a pastor who recognized that there are a lot of books written about being a pastor of a large church in a big city. But there's not a lot of books written about being a pastor of a church in a small town. Of course, the one problem was he says he's from a small town, and then he explains that it has 10,000 people in it. So he doesn't quite know what a small town is, but there were still some helpful things in it, just in thinking through how we as a church can minister to our community. And one of the things he mentioned about a small town is that sometimes in a small town, there's the mindset that nothing big happens in a small town. You know, the boys won the state championship in basketball last year. That's kind of big. But we maybe have the idea that that's about as big as it gets for our small town. And I think with that then, do we maybe think that way as a church? Do we think that nothing real big is going to happen in our small church in this small town? And so we don't expect God to use us for anything very big. And maybe sometimes then we're eager to send money off to other missions, which is really good. This church supports a ton of missions, and that's great. But do we sometimes have the idea that missions happens out there in those other places, and it doesn't really happen in our community? But I think the story of David and Goliath it would challenge us that God wants to use our church in big ways. He wants us to step out confident that God will, in his power, use us to defeat some of those giants we see in our community. Because remember, Jesus has already defeated the ultimate giant. Jesus has already won the victory for us. And so then we have freedom to just do something. To just see a need and say, we're going to do something about it. We might not have the perfect plan, we might not have the perfect answer, but we can't just sit still. We need to do something because God has won the victory. And because God wants to use us to win the victory in those smaller areas, against those smaller giants. And so we can act boldly in faith, trusting that God is powerful enough to use even our small church in a small town. There's one detail in here that I don't think we usually remember from this account. And you'll find it in chapter 17, verse 54. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. And that seems like kind of an odd detail. But according to one source I was reading, at that point, Jerusalem was not part of Israel yet. And so David was going to the city of Jerusalem, going to enemy territory, and showing the head of Goliath to them. And so basically David is saying, guess what, guys? We're coming for you next. Your giant has been defeated. We are coming for you next. And I think maybe we forget that as we trust in God's power, we can have that attitude a little bit. Maybe we can even have a little bit of swagger, saying, yeah, we see all of these problems in our community, but Jesus has already defeated sin, death, and the devil. And so we're coming for you next. We're coming for the problem of broken families. We're coming for the problem of alcoholism because we believe God, we believe Jesus brings healing to those situations. And we believe God wants to use us to bring healing to those situations. And so, as I conclude here, I just want to encourage us to not be afraid to dream big, to not see those situations and say, yeah, we can't do much about that. But instead to look around at our community. There's probably needs in our community that I didn't even mention, but you see them. Look around in our community and trust that God can use us to help in those areas. And start dreaming big about how God can use us. And as your pastor, sometimes I can present some of those dreams. But it's all the better if it comes from you guys. Because you're able to look into situations that I don't see and say, hey, there's a need there. Or you're able to look into situations and say, hey, I know someone in our church who can help in that area. They're gifted in that way. Or you just plain will have ideas that I don't have. And so please remember, you're not paying me to be the dreamer for the church. We need your dreams, we need your ideas. We need your conviction that God is going to use our church to do great things. And then together as a church, let's dream about a transformed Laurel, Nebraska. Let's dream that our church can make a mark on our town. Not because we're so great, not even because we have such great faith, but because we serve a God who is powerful and great. Amen. We'll close our service singing together, Let the Nations Be Glad.
this we shall proclaim to the corners of the earth that Christ is come. Let the nations be glad, let the people rejoice, for salvation